Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Israeli government spokesman Eylon Levy. This is day 67 of the October 7th war. My apologies for starting late today. I've just come back from a tour of the ruins of Kfar Aza, still a little bit shaken up. Nothing really prepares you for visiting the scene of a massacre and seeing outside one of those homes written by the search and rescue team's human remains on the sofa. On the way back, dropping off the protective gear, I met some of the soldiers and told them I hope this awful war is over soon and they can go back home. And then they gave me a slap on the wrist, told me off and told me this war needs to end when it ends, with the destruction of Hamas, because nothing else is going to bring safety for their children back home. So where we are, and let's start with the latest figures, and then we'll take your questions at the end. Since the start of the October 7th massacre, Hamas has fired more than 12,000 missiles at Israel, and the Air Force continues to strike launch posts, including one used to fire rockets at Sderot. More than 2,000 of Hamas's rockets have misfired, the large majority landing back inside the Gaza Strip and causing untold damage and casualties to civilians there. The IDF has notified families of the deaths of 434 soldiers since the start of the massacre. IDF fatalities have risen by 1 since yesterday's update, with the confirmed death of Master Sergeant Reserves Zinger Levy. May his memory be a blessing. The number of hostages held by Hamas in Gaza remains constant at 137. That's in addition to the 4 hostages predating the October 7th massacre. The Red Cross must do more to secure access to those vulnerable hostages so it can finally do its job. The horrific revelations coming out of the Hamas terror dungeons, with at least 20 hostages murdered in captivity, are a reminder that we have no time to spare. Captivity survivor Chen Goldstein-Almog has told media of at least 3 women sexually assaulted by their Hamas captors. Hearing those from first-hand accounts in the Hamas terror dungeons, Hamas must release those hostages immediately and unconditionally, and until it does so, we will continue targeting its terror machine to force it to do so. Some diplomatic updates. We welcome the Biden administration's unwavering and vocal support for our campaign to eliminate Hamas after 10/7. At last night's White House Hanukkah lighting ceremony, the president said the U.S. will continue to provide military assistance to Israel until we get rid of Hamas. Important moral, diplomatic, and material leadership that we, of course, welcome and gratefully acknowledge. In that speech, President Biden reaffirmed what he said immediately after 10/7, that his commitment to the safety of the Jewish people and the state of Israel is, quote, unshakable. The United Nations General Assembly is set to vote today on a resolution calling for to keep the Hamas terror regime in power and shield it from the consequences of 10/7. It's fitting that this comes as the UN celebrates the International Day of Neutrality, because neutrality in the wake of Hamas's October 7th atrocities is complicity with its acts of rape, burning, beheading, mutilation, and abductions. We will continue exercising our right to self-defense against the October 7 monsters, and we're doing more to uphold the rules-based order than those who would give Hamas impunity. This war will end when we can answer the diplomat babysitter test. Would those diplomats voting to save Hamas's skin at the United Nations feel safe babysitting children in Kfar Aza, Be'eri, and near Oz? For that to happen, Hamas must be destroyed, and that is exactly what we will do. Israeli territory will not be a buffer zone against the Hamas terror regime. For those children to sleep safely in their beds again, Hamas will no longer be our neighbor. Some operational updates. Israeli ground forces continue to battle Hamas terrorists disguised as civilians and operating out of civilian buildings. IDF forces have uncovered an RPG training facility inside a mosque in Jabalia, an outrageous desecration, of course, of what is supposed to be a holy space. Our soldiers found a whole weapons cache, some stuffed inside UNRWA bags, raising grave questions about the involvement of that UN agency. The Nahal Brigade has been uncovering Hamas weapons and combat posts in residential areas, finding October 7th related materials in the home of a Nukba terrorist. In recent days, Hamas terrorists have also opened fire from inside a school in southern Gaza. Hamas is doubling down on its despicable human shield strategy, and we are doing our utmost to thwart it. Over the past month, the IDF and Shin Bet have apprehended 500 Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists, including 140 since Hamas resumed hostilities on December 1st when it terminated the hostage release pause. Those numbers include Hamas terrorists who have been surrendering to our forces as their morale crumbles. As IDF Chief of Staff Jody Levy said yesterday at that very bold situation assessment with the head of the Shin Bet in the heart of Khan Yunis, other Hamas terrorists were apprehended while hiding inside civilian buildings. We call on all Hamas terrorists to surrender, and we call on the whole international community to demand that the October 7th monsters hand themselves over to face justice immediately and unconditionally. That's simply the ABC of international peace and security. The more Hamas terrorists surrender, the fewer we will have to eliminate, and the quicker they surrender, the more intelligence we will have to bring this war to a decisive end. This morning, Israel opened the Kerem Shalom crossing for the inspection of humanitarian aid trucks for Gaza. The Nitzana crossing already has excess capacity to inspect aid trucks, and now we have added excess capacity, enough to double the provision of aid to civilians in Gaza. Today we screened the first batch of aid trucks for possible Hamas weapon smuggling at Kerem Shalom before they drove to the Rafah crossing and from there handed over to aid agencies in Gaza. We repeat, there are no restrictions on Israel's part to the entry of humanitarian necessities into Gaza. The problem is the bottleneck at the crossing with Egypt, and the problem is that Israel is currently inspecting aid quicker than UN agencies on the ground are able to deliver it. Israel is constantly monitoring the humanitarian situation, making sure there are areas in which civilians can have access to aid, and we're going above and beyond our obligations under humanitarian law to facilitate the provision of that aid to enemy-controlled territory, all the while Hamas hijacks the aid for itself. And I hope, of course, you've been covering those dramatic images of Hamas hijacking aid trucks inside the Gaza Strip. An update from the northern border. Hezbollah continues its aggression towards Israeli towns and cities, and we are, of course, retaliating accordingly. We repeat, Israel is not interested in a two-front war, but if Hezbollah chooses to drag us into a full-scale war, the state of Lebanon will pay a very heavy price for any armed attacks emanating from its soil. That brings us to the end of today's update. We'll now take your questions. If you could write them in the chat. And as always, we encourage you to send those questions in advance so we can check all the necessary facts and figures you need with the relevant authorities.
First question from Jody Coen from World is One News in India. Following reports that Israeli officials are working with Cyprus to inspect aid deliveries shipped to Gaza from Cyprus, will this be replicated with other countries in order for more aid to be delivered to the people of Gaza? And what is being done to ensure that Hamas isn't stealing aid, as has been reported?
Thanks for your question, Jody. Let me repeat what I just said. There is no problem at the moment in terms of the inspection of aid trucks. That is not responsible in any way for the bottleneck of getting aid into Gaza. There is already excess capacity at Nitzana. The latest figures from Kogat suggest they have an ability to inspect up to 250 trucks at Nitzana. And with the opening of Kerem Shalom now, we will have the ability to double that if the agencies on the ground are able to deliver that aid. The problem is the bottleneck at the Rafah crossing and the fact that the aid agencies on the ground in Gaza are not able to deliver the humanitarian aid at the pace that Israel is able to screen it. And we are, of course, going above and beyond our obligations under international humanitarian law to facilitate the provision of life-saving humanitarian aid to civilians, even in territory controlled by an enemy that continues to bombard our cities with rockets and to continue to target us with attacks. And we are using those inspections at both Nitzana and Kerem Shalom, both of which have excess capacity, in order to make sure that Hamas isn't able to exploit the international community's goodwill in order to smuggle weapons into the Gaza Strip. And we expect the whole international community to firmly insist and to condemn Hamas and call it out when it is found stealing humanitarian aid inside Gaza. And I hope you've seen those images of the civilians in Gaza having aid stolen from them by Hamas. And it is outrageous, really frankly outrageous, that the international agencies on the ground that supposedly feign the most interest for civilians inside Gaza have absolutely nothing to say when the Hamas terror regime steals that aid in order to keep its own fighters well-fed, well-stocked. And as the Hamas terror regime crumbles, we're already beginning to see people in Gaza speaking more freely against the Hamas regime and explaining, pouring out their anger and their frustrations and explaining how they see Hamas and Yahya Sinwar as squarely responsible for the calamity that has befallen them.
Question from Taliamburg, New York Times. How does Israel see the Houthi threat, and what steps will Israel take to counter it?
Talia, question about the Houthi threat. You know, the the slogan of the Houthis, Wikipedia this, check this afterwards because it's difficult to believe. Their slogan is Allahu Akbar, death to America, death to Israel, cursed be the Jews, I'm not making this up, victory to Islam. The Houthis are an Iranian proxy that call for death and destruction with the self-awareness of cartoon villains. Their maritime attacks are a clear threat not only to Israel, but also to international peace and security, to international trade. That threat will be addressed, and we think that this is an important wake-up call, an important reminder for the whole international community about the threat that Iranian aggression poses not only to the state of Israel, not only to our Arab neighbors, but to the whole structure of international trade and international peace and security.
Question from Jim Williams of Zinger International News Service, Washington, D.C. The U.S. Congress is likely not to pass aid to Israel until January. Will this delay in any way hurt the Israeli war effort?
So far, the United States has been standing shoulder to shoulder with us with very clear moral, military and diplomatic support as well. And we welcome as well, as we said, those remarks from President Biden just yesterday at the Hanukkah lighting ceremony at the White House, saying that the United States is going to continue to provide military assistance to Israel until we win. We gratefully welcome that support from our allies in the United States, who understand that the destruction of Hamas is not only a national interest, security interest for us, but a national security interest for the United States, the whole of the West, and indeed the whole of humanity. And we thank them with a great deal of gratitude for that support.
Question from Joel Pollock at Breitbart News. What are the prospects of seeing a hostage rescue?
Israel will, of course, do everything possible to get all the hostages home. Our declared mission is there will be no one left behind, and we will do everything we can to get not only the women, but the men, the young and the old, the civilians and the soldiers. There will be no one left behind. Our strategy is to continue putting unrelenting military pressure on Hamas until it begs for a breather and is willing to release those hostages. We've already seen that strategy vindicated with the hostage release pause. I think 110 hostages released over that time. That strategy has proven itself, that strategy adopted by the War Cabinet, and we're continuing with it now. Wherever it is possible to swoop in with special forces and rescue hostages, we will of course try to do that, but I'll draw your attention to an incident just last week. I think it was on Thursday night when we tried to rescue hostages in a mission that was unsuccessful and led to serious injuries to 2 IDF soldiers who had to be cleared for medical treatment. Unfortunately, Hamas has spent a very long time planning and plotting to abduct our hostages. They've prepared for this moment. They're not holding them in a big airport arrivals hall like in Entebbe where we can just swoop in and pick them up, but wherever an option exists to rescue the hostages and get them out, we will do that. And besides that, we're continuing with the strategy of unrelenting military pressure on Hamas to get it to release all of the hostages. None of us are free till all of them are free.
A further question from Joel Pollock, which is, what is Israel's response to the decision of Harvard University not to dismiss its president despite condoning extreme anti-Israel and anti-Semitic rhetoric?
We're not getting into internal politics in the Harvard Board of Governors, but it's important to put for the record, there must be zero tolerance for anti-Semitism. There must be zero tolerance for calls for violence against Israelis and Jews. Calls to globalize the intifada or wage an intifada are calls for targeted violence against Jews and Israelis around the world. We know what the Intifada is. It was a wave of brutal suicide bombings inside Israel in the early 2000s that, over the space of 4 years, murdered as many people as in the October 7th massacre itself. And there must be zero tolerance for genocidal calls for intifada or for from the river to the sea, which would leave no space for the State of Israel calling for the destruction of the State of Israel. There must be zero tolerance for anti-Semitism and for the various manifestations that tragically we're seeing on university campuses.
A final question from Jim Williams from Zinger. Follow-up. The US are monitoring what is going on the northern border. President Biden and his team have said that if things pick up, the US will support Israel with the military needed. Do you think it will help calm things down on the northern front?
We are, of course, trying to contain the situation, stop the war in Gaza from escalating and spreading to additional fronts, as Hamas has persistently been trying to do since the first moment of October 7th. Our strategy is the destruction of Hamas in Gaza and firm deterrence against Hezbollah in the north. That's why we have the largest ever call-up of reserves. That's why we are responding forcefully to aggression on the northern front. And in that context, we also welcome the two American aircraft battle carrier groups that have come to the Middle East in order to send a very clear message to Hezbollah and anyone else thinking of entering this war. In the words of our friend President Biden, don't.
Question from Dan Williams of Reuters. Is Israel now requiring that its cargo ships make the trip from Asia around Africa rather than through the Red Sea and Suez due to Houthi threats? If so, do you have an estimate of the expected price hike for imported goods?
Dan, I don't have the information at hand to answer your question, but of course the situation in the Red Sea is a clear reminder to the whole world of the threat that the Iranian regime poses to regional and international peace and security, and we expect there to be firm condemnations and action against attempts by Iran to try to disrupt maritime trade and continue its aggression not only against the people of Israel but against the people of the whole world.
Question from Dan Williams, follow-up from Reuters. Does Israel intend to impose a security zone in southern Lebanon in order to keep Hezbollah away from the border? If so, how deep? And would this be enforced on the ground with the IDF on Lebanese soil or with standoff measures such as a shoot-on-sight policy?
Dan, I can't get into specifics, but I'll refer you to the remarks that the Chief of Staff, Zinger Levy, said just the other day, that everyone understands that after 67 days of Hezbollah aggression, beginning with the October 7th war, that situation is going to have to change. It is going to have to change dramatically, and we are working to contain the situation to prevent any escalation in the north. We're focusing at the moment on destroying the October 7th monsters and warning anyone of thinking this conflict not to do so.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. We'll update you tomorrow about the timing of tomorrow's briefing. Thank you.